the sound of hooves was closing in. Her ruthless husband's men were seconds away from dragging her back to a living hell. In a blind panic, she threw herself into the shadows of the woods, grabbing the heavy cloak of a towering stranger and pressing her trembling body against his chest. "Please, hide me," she whispered. She thought she was pleading with a simple traveler. She had no idea the chest she was clinging to belonged to the most lethal predator in the realm. She was running from a monster, straight into the arms of the Alpha King. The rain came down in sheets, turning the forest path into a river of mud that pulled at Claire's boots with every step. Behind her, the distant thunder of hooves grew louder, closer, and she knew with a sick certainty that Aldrich's men had found her trail. She had been running for 2 days, through fields and farmlands, through the night and into the deepening gray of this unfamiliar wood. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, and the thin wool of her dress was soaked through to the skin. The small pouch of her mother's keepsakes bounced against her ribs with every desperate stride, a small anchor of warmth in the cold that was seeping into her bones. The hooves were closer now. She could hear voices, harsh, impatient, calling to one another in the clipped tones of men who were used to being obeyed. Claire ducked behind a thick oak, pressing her back against the rough bark, and tried to quiet her breathing. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain they would hear it. Then she saw him. He was standing at the edge of a small clearing, half hidden in the shadow of the trees, a tall figure wrapped in a dark cloak that hung heavy with rain. He was not moving, not running, not hiding. He simply stood there, watching the path where the riders would appear, as if he had been waiting for something, or someone. A wild, desperate thought seized Claire. Before she could talk herself out of it, she broke from the cover of the oak and stumbled toward him. Her feet slipped on the wet leaves and she nearly fell, but she caught herself and kept going until she was close enough to reach out and grab the edge of his cloak. He turned. His face was half hidden by the hood, but she caught the glint of gray-blue eyes beneath the shadow, sharp and watchful. She did not stop to think about who he was or why a man would be standing alone in a rain-soaked wood at dusk. She only knew that the riders were coming, and that this stranger was her only chance. "Please," she gasped, her voice raw and shaking. "Please, help me. They're coming for me. I didn't do anything wrong, I swear it, but they'll take me back and I can't go back." She was babbling, she knew it, but she could not stop. The words tumbled out of her like water from a broken dam, and she clung to his cloak with both hands, her knuckles white, as if he were the last solid thing in a world that had turned to water. He said nothing for a long moment. The rain drummed on the leaves above them, and the sound of hooves grew louder, closer, until Claire was certain the riders would break through the trees at any second. She turned her head, wild-eyed, searching for an escape that did not exist. Then the stranger moved. His hand closed around her wrist, not roughly, but firmly, with a grip that left no room for argument. He pulled her toward him, and before she could understand what was happening, he had swept his heavy cloak around her, drawing her against his side and covering her completely with the dark, rain-soaked wool. "Quiet," he said, his voice low and even, almost calm. "Don't move, don't speak." She was pressed against him, her face against the rough leather of his tunic, the wet wool of his cloak blocking out the world. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, the solid warmth of him despite the cold rain. She could smell wood smoke and old leather and something else, something sharp and clean, like the air after a storm. The riders broke into the clearing. She heard the splash of hooves in the mud, the creak of saddles, the muttered curses of men who were tired and angry and soaked to the bone. She held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the stranger's side, and prayed. "You there!" a voice called out, harsh and demanding. "A woman! She ran this way. A young woman, in a gray dress, dark hair. Have you seen her?" The stranger did not answer immediately. Claire felt his chest rise and fall with a slow, deliberate breath. "I have seen many things tonight," he said, his voice carrying the quiet weight of a man who was not accustomed to being questioned. "Rain, trees, darkness. I have not seen a woman." The rider laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Funny. We tracked her to this wood. She's here somewhere. If you've got her hidden, I'd advise you to hand her over. She belongs to Lord Aldrich of the Eastmarch, and he doesn't take kindly to anyone who interferes with his property." "Property." The word hit Claire like a slap. She flinched, and the stranger's arm tightened around her, pulling her closer, shielding her from the words as much as from the rain. "I care little for what Lord Aldrich takes kindly to," the stranger said, his voice cool and unhurried. "I am a traveler, sheltering from the rain. I have seen no one. If your business is done here, I suggest you move on before the light fails entirely." There was a long pause. Claire could feel the tension in the air, thick and dangerous, like the moment before a storm breaks. The rider muttered something to his companions, too low for her to catch. And then there was the sound of horses shifting, of leather creaking. "Fine," the rider said at last, "but if we find out you're lying, we'll be back. And I'd hate to be you when that happens." The hooves splashed away, fading into the rain and the gathering dark. Claire stayed pressed against the stranger, hardly daring to breathe, until the sound had completely disappeared. When she finally dared to look up, the stranger had pushed back his hood. She saw his face properly for the first time, a hard, weathered face, with a strong jaw and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His eyes were gray-blue, sharp as winter ice, and they looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, too breathless to speak. She was trembling, she realized, from cold and fear and the sudden, dizzying relief of being safe, at least for now. "Can you walk?" She nodded, then hesitated. I don't know where I am. I've been running for 2 days. I don't know where to go." The stranger studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, as if coming to a decision. "There is a hunting lodge not far from here," he said. "A half-hour's walk. You can shelter there for the night. The storm will pass by morning, and then—" He paused, his eyes flickering over her rain-soaked dress and tick-kicked boots. "Then we can decide what to do with you." Claire hesitated. Every instinct told her to be wary of this man, this tall, silent stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and spoken to armed riders as if they were no more than a nuisance. But the rain was cold, the night was falling, and she had nowhere else to go. "Thank you," she said quietly. I owe you. I don't even know your name." "You don't need to," he said, and there was something in his voice, not cold exactly, but careful, guarded, like a man who was not used to giving anything of himself away. "Come, the lodge is this way." He turned and began to walk, his long strides eating up the muddy ground. Claire hurried after him, clutching her mother's pouch to her chest, her heart still pounding with the aftermath of Fayapot. She did not know who this man was, or why he had helped her, or what would happen when morning came. But for the first time in 2 days, she was not running. And somehow, that felt like a small miracle. The hunting lodge was small and rough-hewn, a single room with a stone hearth, a narrow bed, and a stack of dry firewood piled against one wall. The stranger built a fire with practiced efficiency, and soon the room was filled with the warm orange glow of flames and the comforting smell of wood smoke. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket he had found somewhere, her wet dress hanging over a chair near the fire. She was still shivering, but the warmth was slowly seeping back into her bones. The stranger did not sit. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out into the rain-swept darkness. His cloak had been hung to dry, and in the firelight, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the way the leather tunic stretched across his back. He was a big man, she realized, taller and broader than she had first thought, with the build of someone who had spent a lifetime doing hard physical work. "Thank you," she said again, her voice small in the quiet room, "for what you did. You didn't have to help me." He did not turn around. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." She waited for him to say more, but he was silent. The fire crackled, and the rain drummed on the roof, and Claire found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the way the firelight caught the edge of his jaw. "Why did you help me?" she asked at last. He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes were dark in the firelight, unreadable. "Because you asked," he said simply. And because you looked like you had nowhere else, you go. Claire felt something twist in her chest, something that was not quite gratitude, not quite relief, but something else entirely, something she could not name. She opened her mouth to say something, she did not know what, but he was already turning back to the window. "Sleep," he said. "You're safe here. No one will find you tonight." She wanted to argue. She wanted to ask who he was, where he came from, why a man like him would be walking alone through a rain-soaked wood at dusk. But the warmth of the fire and the exhaustion of 2 days of running were pulling at her, heavy and insistent. She lay down on the narrow bed, still wrapped in the blanket, and closed her eyes. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the stranger's silhouette against the window, dark and still, watching the rain. She did not dream. When Claire woke, the fire had burned down to embers, and the rain had stopped. The morning light was gray and soft, filtering through the small window and casting pale shadows across the rough-hewn wooden walls. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching from 2 days of hard travel, and looked around the room. The stranger was standing by the door, his cloak back on his shoulders, his hood pushed back. He was watching her, had been watching her, she realized. Perhaps for some time. His gray-blue eyes were steady, unreadable. And there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She could only look at him, this tall, silent stranger who had pulled her out of the rain and shielded her from her pursuers, and wonder who he was. He held her gaze for a long moment, then very slowly the corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Good morning," he said, and Claire Weiss, who had been running for 2 days, who had left behind everything she knew, who had grabbed a stranger's cloak in the rain without knowing who he was, Claire felt something shift inside her, like the first crack of light through a storm-darkened sky. She did not know that this man was Edward of House Thornwood, the Alpha King of the entire territory. She did not know that the fate she had been running from was about to lead her somewhere she had never imagined. She only knew that, for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid to wake up. The morning light came through the small window of the hunter's hut in pale gold ribbons, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. Claire sat up slowly, her back stiff from a night spent on the narrow cot, and for a moment she had to remind herself where she was. The rain had stopped. The fire in the hearth had burned down to soft orange coals, and beside it, on a 3-legged stool, sat the stranger from the night before. He was not looking at her. He was turning a small tin cup in his hands, watching the steam rise from it, his expression unreadable in the half-light. She remembered, all at once, how she had grabbed his cloak in the rain, how she had pressed herself against his arm, breathless and desperate, begging him to help her hide. She had not even seen his face clearly until this moment. He was taller than she had thought, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cropped short and a thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His clothes were simple but well-made, leather and dark wool, no ornament, no sigil. But there was something about the way he sat, still and watchful, that made her think of a hawk perched on a high branch. "Good morning," he said again, as if he had felt her gaze. He did not turn his head. "There is water," and bread in the cloth by the door. Claire blinked. You kept bread?" Now he did look at her, and there was something almost like amusement in his gray-blue eyes. "I kept bread," he said. "I also kept the fire and the roof and the door. I am a very careful host." She did not know whether to laugh or to be embarrassed. She pulled the rough blanket tighter around her shoulders and swung her legs over the edge of the cot. Her boots were still damp from the night before, and she could see her breath in the cold air. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I am sorry I grabbed you like that. I did not mean to—" "You were running from someone," he said it simply, as a statement, not a question. He set the tin cup down and finally turned to face her fully. "I assumed you had your reasons." Claire's throat tightened. She had prepared a dozen lies on the road, that she was a merchant's widow, a traveling healer, a messenger sent by her father, but the words died on her tongue when she met his eyes. There was no judgment in them, no curiosity even, just a calm, patient waiting, as if he had all the time in the world. "I was running from someone," she admitted. It was not the whole truth, but it was not a lie either. The man nodded once, slowly. Then he stood, and she realized just how tall he really was. He filled the small hut like a tree fills a clearing. He crossed to the hearth, picked up the kettle, and poured hot water into a second cup. He held it out to her. "Drink first," he said. "Then we will talk about what happens next." She took the cup. The warmth seeped through her cold fingers, and she realized she had not felt warm in 2 days. She wrapped both hands round the tin and brought it to her lips. It was plain water, nothing more. It tasted like the best thing she had ever drunk. He watched her drink, then sat back down on the stool, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely in front of him. The firelight caught the left side of his face, and she saw again the pale line of the scar above his eyebrow. It was an old wound, healed long ago. "I am called Edward," he said. "I have a hunting lodge a half-day's ride north of here. I was returning from a visit to the border when you found me." Found me, she thought. She had not found him. She had practically tackled him out of the bushes, soaked and trembling with armed riders closing in behind her. But she did not correct him. "I am Claire," she said. He did not ask for her surname, she noticed that. She had expected him to ask. People always asked, to place you in the world, to know whether you were worth their time. But Edward simply nodded, as if Claire was enough. "Claire," he repeated. "Then, Claire, I have a question for you." Her heart quickened. Here it comes, she thought. He is going to ask who I am running from. He is going to ask what I did. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. She stared at him. "What? Where do you want to go?" He said it again, patiently, as if he had all the time in the world. "Not where you came from, not where you are running from. Where do you want to go?" Claire opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She had not thought about it. In 2 days of running, she had not let herself think past the next hill, the next tree, the next moment when she was sure they would catch her. She had been so focused on escaping that she had never once asked herself where she was escaping to. She stopped. The tin cup trembled in her hands. "I do not know." Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then, very gently, he said, "Then you may stay here for a while, until you figure it out." She felt tears prick at her eyes, sudden and unwanted. She turned her face away, pretending to look at the fire, and blinked hard until they receded. "You do not even know me," she said, her voice rougher than she intended. "I could be a criminal. I could be a thief. I could be—" "You could be," he agreed, "but you are not. I have seen enough of the world to know the look of someone who is running from harm, not causing it." She did not know what to say to that. She had spent so long being told what she was, too quiet, too stubborn, too much trouble, not enough worth, that she had forgotten how to simply be believed. They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled. Outside a bird called, sharp and clear in the cold morning air. Claire drank her water and tried to remember the last time someone had asked her what she wanted. Not what she should do, not what was expected of her, but what she wanted. She could not remember. "You said you were returning from the border," she said finally, to fill the silence. "Are you a soldier?" Edward's mouth twitched. "Something like that." "A merchant?" "No." She hesitated. "A lord?" He did not answer immediately. He reached down and picked up a piece of kindling, turned it over in his fingers, then tossed it into the fire. The flames licked at it, caught, and grew. "Something like that," he said again. She did not press. She had learned long ago that people told you what they wanted you to know, and no amount of asking would hurry them. She had also learned to be grateful for what was offered freely. The morning stretched on. Edward went outside to check on his horse, a big, dark stallion with a white star on its forehead, tied to a tree behind the hut. Claire walked in through the window as he spoke softly to the animal, running a hand down its neck. There was a gentleness in the gesture that surprised her. When he came back inside, he was carrying her cloak. It was dry now, though still wrinkled and stained with mud. He handed it to her. "Your things," he said. "I hung it by the fire last night." She took it, running her fingers over the rough wool. It was her cloak, the one her mother had made for her 3 winters ago, patched at the elbow, frayed at the hem. She had grabbed it in the dark of her room 2 nights ago, along with a small cloth pouch, and nothing else. The pouch. She touched her waist, where the pouch was tied to her belt, and felt the familiar lump of it against her hip. It was still there. She had not lost it. Edward noticed the gesture. He did not comment, but she saw his eyes flick down to her waist, and then away, as if he were giving her privacy she had not asked for. "There is a village a day's ride from here," he said, changing the subject. "A small place, but they have a decent inn and a healer who takes in travelers. If you want, I can take you there tomorrow, or you can stay here another day, rest, and decide for yourself what comes next." She should say yes to the village. She knew she should. What could she offer this tall, quiet stranger by staying? Nothing but trouble. The men who were chasing her were not the kind to give up easily. If they found her here under his roof, they would not hesitate to hurt him too. But the thought of getting back on the road, of running again, of not knowing where she would sleep the next night, or whether she would sleep at all, it made her chest tighten until she could barely breathe. "May I?" She paused, swallowed. "May I stay here for today? Just today? To think?" He qualified her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Today," he said. "We will eat breakfast, and then you can think." He did not ask anything else. He did not tell her that staying was foolish or dangerous or inconvenient. He simply accepted her answer and turned to the hearth to start the fire going again for the morning meal. Claire sat on the edge of the cot, holding her mother's cloak in her arms, watching this strange, kind man move around the small hut as if he had lived there his whole life. He was careful with his movements, efficient, deliberate, never wasting a gesture. She had seen men like this before, in her father's house, in the guards who patrolled the village walls, men who had learned to move like this because they had to be ready for anything. But there was something different about him, a stillness beneath the readiness, like the calm surface of a deep lake. She thought about what he had said. "Where do you want to go?" She still did not have an answer, but for the first time in 2 days, she felt like she had time to find one. The morning passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Edward made a simple meal, hard cheese, bread, dried apples steeped in hot water until they softened. He did not try to make conversation, and he did not press her to talk. They ate side by side on the 2 stools, watching the fire, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. When the meal was finished, Edward stood and reached for his cloak, which hung on a peg by the door. "I will be back before sundown," he said. "There is wood by the back wall if you need to build up the fire, and bread on the shelf if you get hungry." "You are leaving?" She heard the alarm in her own voice and was embarrassed by it. She had known this man for less than a day. She had no right to be frightened of being alone, and no reason to think he would not come back. Edward paused at the door, one hand on the latch. He looked at her, and for a moment his face softened. Just a little, just enough for her to see that he was not as cold as he seemed. "I said I would be back before sundown," he said. "I keep my word." Then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, and Claire was alone in the hut. She sat for a long time, listening to the sound of his horse's hoofs fading into the forest. The fire crackled, the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a bird sang a song she had not heard since she was a child, sitting on her mother's lap in the garden of a house she would never see again. She put her hand on the pouch at her belt and held it until the lump in her throat went away. Then she stood, walked to the window, and watched the empty road that led away from the hut and into the world she had left behind. She did not know where she was going. She did not know who this man was, or why he had chosen to help her, or what would happen when the men who were chasing her finally caught up. But she knew one thing, with a certainty that surprised her. She was not ready to run again. The afternoon light was fading when Claire heard the sound of hooves on the path. She had spent the hours since his departure in a quiet kind of restlessness. She had swept the floor of the hut, though it was already clean. She had retied the bundle of dried herbs she carried in her pouch, though the twine was still firm. She had stood at the window more times than she could count, watching the empty road, and now he was back. She did not rush to the door. Something in her had learned, in the space of a single day, that this man was not the sort you greet, think with fuss and hurry. So she waited, standing in the middle of the room, until the door opened. Edward stepped inside, and the first thing she noticed was that he was holding his left arm oddly close to his body, as if cradling it. The second thing she noticed was the dark stain on his sleeve, still wet, spreading slowly across the gray wool. "You are bleeding," she said. He looked down at his arm as if he had forgotten about it. "It is nothing, a branch on the path." Claire did not believe him. She had grown up in a village where men said that about broken bones and deep cuts alike, and she had learned, early, that nothing usually meant something you do not wish to speak of. "Sit down," she said quietly. He blinked at her, as if he was not used to being told what to do, but after a moment he crossed to the low bench by the fire and sat, stretching his left leg out in front of him. Claire knelt beside him and reached for his sleeve. She did not ask permission. She simply rolled the wet wool up, carefully, until the wound was visible. It was not a branch. It was a long, jagged gash running from his wrist halfway to his elbow, the edges of the skin torn and uneven. It had been cleaned hastily. Someone had poured water over it, maybe from a stream, but it had not been bandaged, and it was still oozing blood. "This needs stitching," she said, "or at least a proper binding. Do you have bandages?" He gestured with his chin toward a wooden chest in the corner. "Linens, in there." Claire crossed to the chest and opened it. Inside, folded neatly, were a spare shirt, a roll of clean linen, and a small leather pouch that smelled faintly of herbs. She brought them back to the bench and knelt down again. "This will hurt," she said. "I have had worse." "I am sure you have. But this will still hurt." For the first time since he had entered the hut, something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "You are not afraid of me?" It was not a question. Claire paused, her hands hovering over the wound, and looked up at him. "Should I be?" He did not answer. His eyes, gray-blue and unreadable, held hers for a long moment. Then he looked away, toward the fire. Claire set to work. She was gentle but efficient, the way her mother had taught her to be. And she talked as she worked, the way her mother had taught her as well. "My mother was the healer in our village," she said, as she poured water from the kettle over the wound. "She said a patient who is talked to is a patient who is calmer. I think she was right. I think I am the one who was calmer, if I am honest." Edward said nothing, but he did not pull away. Claire cleaned the wound carefully, picking out a small piece of bark that had embedded itself in the torn skin. He did not flinch. She bound it tightly with the linen, then tied it off with a neat knot. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "That should hold until you can see a proper physician." "I will not see a physician for this." "Then you will let it heal as it heals. But it will heal better if you keep it clean." She hesitated, then added, "And if you do not do whatever it was you did to get this. A branch, you said." He looked at her, and this time there was no mistaking the expression on his face. It was not amusement. It was something quieter, closer to surprise. "It was a branch," he said. "A very large, very angry branch with tusks." Claire blinked, then, despite herself, she laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a breath, but it filled the quiet hut like a bell. "A branch with tusks," she repeated. "You were gored by a boar. I prefer my version. I am sure you do. Does the lord of this territory know his hunters are so careless?" The words came out before she thought about them. She felt the blood rise to her cheeks and looked down at her hands, suddenly very interested in the linen scraps at her feet. "I did not mean," she began. "It is fine," Edward said quietly. "He does not know, and I would rather not trouble him with such a small matter." Claire nodded, relieved. She stirred and carried the soiled linens to the wash bucket by the door, then returned to the fire and set the kettle on to boil. "Would you like some tea?" she asked. "I have herbs in my pouch. It is not much, but it helps with the pain. I am fine. The tea is not for the wound. It is for the hunter who is sitting very still and pretending his arm does not hurt." Silence. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted. "Very well," he said. "Tea." She made the tea the way her mother had taught her, with steady hands and a careful measure of the dried leaves. When she handed him the cup, he took it with his good hand, and she noticed again the pale line around his left ring finger, the place where a ring had once rested. She did not ask. They sat in silence for a while, drinking the tea. The fire crackled, the wind moved through the trees outside, and for the first time since she had fled her home, Claire felt something that might have been peace. "My mother used to sing a song," she said, without meaning to say it aloud. When she was binding a wound that was worse than it looked, she said the song helped the body remember how to heal. What song? Claire did not answer at first. She looked down at her own hands, at the small scar on her left pinky, where she had burned herself as a girl. Thing for a pot that was too hot. It is an old song, she said, about a bird that loses its way in the dark, and the stars that guide it home. She paused. I have not heard it in a long time. Sing it. The request was so simple, so direct, that she did not think to refuse. She opened her mouth, and the melody came to her as if it had been waiting all these years, just below the surface of her memory. It was a quiet song, barely more than a hum at first, then slowly taking shape. The words were in an old tongue, half-remembered, but the tune was true, and she let it carry her the way she had let it carry her as a child, sitting on her mother's lap in the garden of a house she would never see again. When she finished, the hut was very quiet. The fire had burned down to embers. The wind had stopped, as if the forest itself had paused to listen. Edward was watching her. His face was unreadable, but his hand, resting on his knee, had stilled around the empty cup. "What is it called?" he asked. "I do not know," she said honestly. "My mother never told me. She said it did not need a name, it only needed to be sung." He nodded slowly. Then he set the cup down and stood, crossing to the window and looking out into the dark. "Thank you," he said, "for the tea and for the song." "You are welcome," she hesitated. "And for the wound, please let it heal. The world has enough men who refuse to admit they are hurt." He did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense just slightly before he relaxed again. "Good night, Claire," he said. "Good night, Edward." She gathered her shawl and retreated to the small alcove where she had slept the night before. She did not expect to sleep, but the warmth of the fire, the quiet of the hut, and the memory of the song had wrapped themselves round her like a blanket, and she drifted off without meaning to. When she woke, the morning light was pale and gray through the shutters. She rose, folded her shawl, and walked quietly to the main room. Edward was gone. The fire had been banked, a fresh log laid ready for lighting. A pot of water sat on the hearth, still warm, and on the table in a small clay cup was a cluster of wildflowers, late autumn asters, their petals a deep, quiet purple. There was no note, no explanation, just the flowers, fresh picked, their stems still damp. Claire stood in the middle of the room for a long time looking at them. She did not know why her eyes stung. She did not know why her hands trembled as she reached out and touched the petals, soft and cool beneath her fingers. She did not know who this man was, or what he was hiding behind his quiet eyes and his careful words. But she knew with a certainty that surprised her that no one had ever left her wildflowers before. And she knew, too, that she was not ready to leave this place. She was not ready to leave him. The morning came cold and clear, the first frost silvering the grass outside the hunting lodge. Claire woke to the smell of wood smoke and something warm, bread, perhaps, toasted over the fire. She lay still for a moment, listening to the crackle of flames and the distant call of a crow, and let herself pretend, just for a moment, that this was an ordinary morning in an ordinary life. Then she remembered the wildflowers. She had pressed them between the pages of a small leather-bound book she carried in her pack, and she had slept with the book beneath her pillow, as though it were something precious. She rose, washed her face in the cold water basin, and braided her hair with quick, practiced fingers. When she stepped in the main room, Edward was already there, dressed in his traveling cloak, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression softened, just barely, just for an instant. "There is a carriage waiting," he said. "It will take us to Thornwood Castle. It is not far, half a day's ride." Claire nodded, her stomach tightening. She had known this moment would come. The lodge had been a pause, a breath between one life and another. Now the breath was over. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Edward did not answer. He simply picked up her pack, the one she had left by the door, and carried it out into the morning light. The carriage was old but well kept, its wood polished and its wheels sturdy. A driver sat atop the bench, a grizzled man with a weather-beaten face who nodded to Claire but said nothing. Edward helped her up into the carriage, his hand steady beneath her elbow, and then climbed in, across from her. The door closed with a soft thud, and they were moving. The road wound through the forest past oaks and ash trees whose leaves had turned gold and rust. Claire watched the trees slide past the window, her hands folded in her lap. She thought about the village she had left behind, about the life she had walked away from. She thought about her mother, who had died 3 winters ago, and about the small silver ring that lay at the bottom of her pack, wrapped in a square of linen. She had not opened the pouch since she fled. She was not sure she was ready to. The carriage hit a rut in the road, jolting hard. Claire gasped, bracing herself against the seat. The jolt sent her pack sliding across the floor of the carriage, and the small cloth pouch, the one with her mother's things, tumbled out, landing at Edward's feet. Claire reached for it at the same moment Edward bent to pick it up. Their hands brushed, and Claire pulled back as though burned. Edward held the pouch in his palm. It was small and worn, the fabric soft with age, tied with a faded blue ribbon. He looked at it for a long moment, and Claire held her breath, waiting for him to ask what was inside. He did not. He held the pouch out to her, his gray-blue eyes steady on hers. "Your things," he said. "Keep them safe." Claire took the pouch, her fingers closing around the worn fabric. Something in her chest loosened. "Thank you," she said. "You could have opened it." "It is not mine to open," Edward said simply. He turned his gaze back to the window, and the moment passed. Thornwood Castle rose from the hillside like a sleeping beast, its gray stone walls crowned with banners that snapped in the wind. The carriage rolled through the outer gate, past a guardhouse where men in leather and iron nodded to the driver, and into a courtyard paved with worn cobblestones. Claire pressed her face to the window, taking it in. The great hall with its tall, arched windows, the kitchens with their chimneys smoking, the stables where horses stamped and nickered. It was a working fortress, not a showpiece. Everything about it spoke of purpose. Edward helped her down from the carriage, and she stood in the courtyard for a moment, feeling small and out of place. Servants moved past with baskets and buckets, glancing at her with open curiosity. A young woman carrying an armful of linens stopped and stared, then hurried on when Edward's gaze flicked toward her. A sharp voice cut through the bustle. "Well, well, and who is this you have brought home, my lord?" Claire turned to see an older woman striding toward them across the courtyard. She's hat was tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that looked as though it had seen everything, and judged most of it lacking. She wore a plain woolen gown and an apron, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had run this castle for a very long time. "This is Claire," Edward said. "She is a distant relation of the Ashford family. She will be staying with us for a time." The woman's eyebrows rose. "A distant relation," she repeated as though tasting the words. "I see. And does this distant relation have a name for me to call her by, or shall I just call her the guest?" "Claire," Claire said quickly, stepping forward. "Claire of Ashford Village. It is a pleasure to meet you." The older woman studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The worn hem of Claire's dress, the faded green of her cloak, the way she held herself with careful politeness. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, and the smile transformed her face. "Well, Claire of Ashford Village," she said, "I am Martha, and I have run this castle for 40 years. So if you need anything, you come to me. And if you break anything, you also come to me. Because I will find out anyway. Come along, I will show you to your room." She turned and marched toward the keep, and Claire hurried to follow, casting one glance back at Edward. He was watching her go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked toward the stables, and Claire was left alone with Martha. The room Martha showed her was small but clean, tucked away at the top of a narrow staircase in the east wing. There was a bed with a straw mattress and woolen blankets, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, and a small window that looked out over the castle gardens. The gardens were bare, the flower beds empty, but there was a bench beneath a bare oak tree, and Claire thought she would like to sit there when the weather was warmer. Supper is at dusk, Martha said from the doorway. We eat in the kitchens, not in the great hall unless there is company. You will sit with me and the other household women, and you will eat what is put in front of you, and you will not complain, because the cook is sensitive. I would never complain, Claire said. I am grateful to be here. Martha's expression softened slightly. I expect you are, she said. A girl does not end up in a place like this by accident, no matter what the Lord says about distant relations. But I am not one to pry, and the Lord's business is the Lord's business. You are welcome here, child, for as long as you need. Claire blinked, surprised by the warmth in the older woman's voice. Thank you, Martha. Martha nodded, then turned to go. At the door, she paused. One more thing, she said. The Lord has not smiled in 5 years. Not truly. I have not seen him smile since his wife died, but I saw him look at you in the courtyard, and I thought, perhaps, he might remember how... She left before Claire could respond, her footsteps echoing down the staircase. That night, after supper, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, the small cloth pouch in her hands. The candles had burned low, and the castle had grown quiet around her. She untied the faded blue ribbon and tipped the contents under her palm. The dried flowers, lavender and rosemary, pressed and crumbling at the edges, still carried a faint, sweet scent, and beneath them, the silver ring. It was plain, unadorned, worn smooth by years of wear. Her mother had worn it on her right hand, and Claire had always loved the way it caught the light. She held the ring up to the candle, watching the flame flicker through the circlet of silver. Her mother had given it to her on her deathbed, pressing it into Claire's palm with trembling fingers. Keep this, her mother had said. It was your grandmother's and hers before that. It is not worth much, but it is yours. It is who you are. Claire had not understood then what her mother meant. She understood now. The ring was not a promise to anyone else. It was a promise to herself, a reminder of where she came from, and of the woman who had loved her without condition. She was still holding it when a soft knock came at her door. She rose, tucking the ring back into the pouch, and opened the door. Edward stood in the corridor, a lantern in his hand. His face was half in shadow, and he looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him. I wanted to make sure you were settled, he said. The castle can be cold at night. If you need more blankets, Martha will. I am fine, Claire said. Truly, please don't worry about me. Edward was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have business in the north tomorrow. I will be gone for 2 days. Martha will look after you while I am away. Claire's stomach dropped. 2 days. She had only just arrived, and already he was leaving. Of course, she said, keeping her voice steady. I will be fine. Edward nodded. He hesitated, as though he wanted to say something more, but then he simply said, Good night, Claire, and turned and walked away. Claire watched him go, her fingers still closed around the pouch with her mother's ring inside. She did not know why the thought of his leaving made her chest ache. She closed the door and sat back down on the bed, the pouch clutched to her chest. She had been running for so long, she had almost forgotten what Lee had liked to want to stay. But she wanted to stay. That was the trouble. Outside, beyond the castle walls, a rider in a dark cloak was making his way along the border road. He reined in his horse at the edge of the Thornwood lands, peering through the darkness toward the distant towers of the castle. In his saddlebag was a letter, sealed with the crest of Lord Aldrich, and it bore a single instruction: find her, bring her back. The 2 days of Edward's absence passed more slowly than Claire cared to admit. She filled the hours as best she could. She helped Martha in the kitchen, shelling peas and kneading dough until her wrists ached. She swept the hearth in the great hall, though Martha fussed at her and said a guest should not be doing such work. She even ventured into the castle garden, where the last of the autumn roses clung to their bushes, pale and stubborn against the coming frost. But every evening, when she sat alone in her room with the pouch of her mother's ring pressed against her palm, she found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats in the courtyard. She found herself watching the western road, the one he had taken. She did not know why she kept doing it. She told herself it was only gratitude. He had given her shelter, safety, a place to rest. It was natural to wish for the safe return of a man who had been kind to her. It was natural. That was what she repeated to herself over and over until the words lost their shape. On the third evening, she heard the gate open. She was in the garden at the time, gathering the last of the rose hips for a tea she had promised Martha. The sound of iron hinges and the jingle of bridles carried across the courtyard, and she straightened, her basket dangling from her arm, her heart suddenly beating in a way he could not explain. She did not run to the gate. She told herself she would not do that. She merely walked, slowly, along the gravel path as though she had all the time in the world. But when she rounded the corner of the stable block, she saw him. He was dismounting from a dark horse, his boots hitting the cobblestones with a solid thud. His hair was wind-tossed, his cloak dusted with the pale grit of the northern roads. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had ridden hard to get home. And then he looked up, and he saw her. For a moment, neither of them moved. The evening air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and drying leaves. A stable boy came to take the horse, and Edward handed over the reins without looking away from her. "You are back," Claire said. It was a foolish thing to say. Of course he was back. He was standing right there. "I said I would be." His voice was rough, as though he had not spoken much on the road. 2 days. I meant 2 days. She nodded. She did not know what to do with her hands, so she clutched the basket tighter. "Martha said you would be? She said you always keep your word." Something flickered in his gray-blue eyes. It was there and gone before she could name it. "I try to." The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but full of all the things neither of them had said yet. The horse stamped its hoof in the stable, and Edward seemed to remember himself. He cleared his throat. "The roads are getting worse," he said. "The frost is settling in the north. Another few weeks and the passes will be closed." "You should rest," Claire said. "You have been riding all day." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he said, "I find I am not tired." She did not know what to make of that. She stood out with her basket of rose hips, and he stood there with his travel-worn cloak, and neither of them seemed willing to be the first to walk away. It was Martha who broke the spell. The old housekeeper appeared at the kitchen door, her hands on her hips, her voice carrying across the courtyard like a bell. "There you are, both of you, standing about like a pair of cold statues. Come inside, the both of you, before you catch your deaths." Edward almost smiled. Claire saw it, the corner of his mouth twitching before he smoothed his expression back into its usual severity. "We are coming, Martha." Said Martha, and went back inside. Claire fell into step beside Edward as they crossed the courtyard. She did not plan it. Her feet simply moved in the same direction as his, and he did not quicken his pace to pull ahead. They walked together, not touching, not speaking, but aware of each other with every step. That night she could not sleep. She lay in her bed for what felt like hours, watching the moonlight crawl across the ceiling. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the shutters and sending dry leaves skittering across the stones. She thought about the way Edward had looked at her in the courtyard, as though he had been searching for something and had found it. She thought about the way he had said, "I find I am not tired." She did not know what it meant. She only knew that it made her chest feel tight in a way that was not unpleasant. Finally, she gave up on sleep. She pulled on her woolen shawl over her nightdress, slipped her feet into her worn leather shoes, and opened her door. The corridor was dark and silent, lit only by the thin moonlight that came through the narrow windows. She did not light a candle. She knew the way to the garden well enough by now. The garden, and at night, was a different place. The flowers were gray shadows, the paths, silver paths of moonlight. The air was cold and clean and smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. She walked slowly, letting the chill settle her thoughts, letting the quiet do its work. She was not expecting to find anyone else there, but when she rounded the corner by the old stone bench, she stopped. Edward was sitting on the bench, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He was not wearing his armor, only a plain linen shirt and a woolen tunic, and his hair was still damp from washing. He looked younger in the moonlight. He also looked very alone. He heard her footsteps and looked up. For a moment, there was something like surprise on his face. Then it smoothed away, replaced by that careful neutrality she had come to recognize. "Claire," he said, "you are awake." "I could not sleep," she said. She hesitated, then added, "I did not mean to intrude. I will go back inside." "Stay." The word came out before he seemed to think about it. He blinked, as though surprised by his own voice. Then he said, more quietly, "If you want to. The night is fine. It is a shame to waste it." She stood there for a moment, weighing the invitation. Then she walked over and sat down on the bench beside him, leaving a careful space between them. The stone was cold through her thin nightdress, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. They sat in silence for a while. The wind moved through the bare branches of the apple tree, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out, once, twice, then fell silent. "It is strange," Edward said finally, "how quiet it is here. You would think a castle this size would be full of noise, but at night it feels like the whole world has gone to sleep and left you alone." Claire considered that. "I used to feel that way at home," she said. "Before I would get up early, before anyone else, and walk through the village while it was still dark. It felt like I was the only person awake in the whole world. It was lonely, but it was also freeing." "Freeing," Edward repeated, as though tasting the word. "I know that feeling." She looked at him. In the moonlight, the scar over his left eyebrow was a pale line against his skin. She had noticed it before, but she had never asked. It was not her place to ask. "You asked me once," she said quietly, "what I was running from." He went very still. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the dark shape of the garden wall, his hands still clasped in front of him. I did not answer you." "No, you did not." She took a breath. The words felt heavy in her chest, like stones she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten they were there. "I was betrothed to a man named Aldrich, Lord Aldrich of the Western Holdings. My mother arranged it before she died. She thought it would be a good match, a safe match." Edward did not move. He did not speak. He simply waited, and his waiting was patient in a way that made it easier to go on. "At first I thought it would be all right," Claire said. "He was polite. He brought gifts. He spoke well of my mother, and of our house. I told myself that I was lucky, that many girls would be grateful for such a match. But you were not grateful." It was not a question. "No." She heard her own voice grow smaller, quieter. "He changed. After the betrothal was announced, he changed. He began to tell me what to wear, what to say, who I was allowed to speak to. He said it was for my own good. He said he knew what was best for me. That I was young and foolish, and did not understand the world." She paused. The memory of Aldrich's voice, smooth and condescending, slid through her like a cold draught. She pulled her shawl tighter. "He said," she went on, her voice barely above a whisper, "that without him, I would be nothing. That no one else would ever want me. That I should be grateful he had chosen me at all." The silence that followed was long. She did not look at Edward. She could not bear to see his face, to see what he thought of her now. She had told no one this, not Martha, not anyone. It had been locked inside her for so long that saying it out loud felt like pulling a splinter from a wound. And then Edward spoke. He said wrong. She looked up, startled. His face was hard, harder than she had ever seen it, but his eyes were not cold. They were burning, low and fierce like banked coals. "He said wrong," Edward repeated. "You are not nothing. You are not less because he chose you. He was the one who was not enough. He was the one who did not deserve you." Claire's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no words came. Edward turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, his gray-blue eyes were bright, almost silver. "You ran," he said. "You ran in the rain, alone, with nothing but the clothes you were wearing and a small pouch of your mother's things. You did not have a plan. You did not have a destination. You just knew that you could not stay. That is not the act of a weak woman. That is the act of a woman who knows her own worth." A tear slipped down Claire's cheek. She did not even realize she was crying until she felt it. cold against her skin. She walked away quickly, embarrassed, but Edward did not look away. "You are brave," he said, his voice low and rough. "Braver than you know," thinking a bench pad, "and whatever he told you, whatever he made you believe about yourself, it was a lie." Claire's breath hitched. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that was building in her chest. She had been so strong for so long. She had run so far. And now, here, in this quiet garden with a man she barely knew, she was falling apart. Edward did not reach for her. He did not try to comfort her with words. He simply sat there, beside her, unmoving, present, as though he would stay there for as long as she needed him to. And somehow, that was enough. When the tears finally stopped, Claire felt wrung out, hollow, but also lighter, as though she had set down a burden she had been carrying for years. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and laughed, a small, shaky sound. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to cry all over you." "There is nothing to be sorry for," Edward said. His voice was gentle, gentler than she had ever heard it. "Tears are not weakness, Claire. They are proof that you have survived something that tried to break you." She looked at him, and for the first time she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. A shadow, a grief that he carried with him, as familiar as his own breath. "You have lost someone," she said softly. "I can see it in you." Edward's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he would close himself off, retreat behind that careful wall of control. But then he let out a long breath, and something in his shoulders loosened. "Yes," he said. "I have." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, a bridge of shared sorrow that neither of them had expected to find. They sat in silence for a long time after that, side by side on the cold stone bench. Watch the King moon climb higher over the garden wall. The wind had died down and the night had grown still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, Edward spoke. "There is a market in the northern village in 3 days. It is a small thing, but they have good honey there, and the blacksmith doth fine work." Claire blinked, confused by the sudden change in subject. "A market?" "Yes." He did not look at her. He was staring at the garden wall again, but his voice was careful, almost hesitant. "I thought you might like to see it. Get out of the castle for a day. Change your mind." She understood. Then, he was not talking about the market. He was talking about her, about the fact that she had been hiding, first in the rain, then in a hunter's hut, then in a castle that was not her home. He was offering her the simple gift of a day outside, among people, where she could pretend to be ordinary for a few hours. She felt her heart soften, like wax melting near a flame. "I would like that," she said. "Very much." Edward nodded. He did not smile, but something in his face eased, a tension she had not even noticed until it was gone. "I will take you myself," he said, "if you do not mind the ride." "I do not mind," Claire said. They sat for a while longer, until the moon had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, and the cold had seeped through their clothes. Then, wordlessly, they rose and walked back to the castle together. Their shoulders did not touch, but Claire felt the warmth of his presence beside her like a candle in the dark. When they reached her door, Edward stopped. He looked at her, his gray-blue eyes unreadable in the dim corridor light. "Claire," he said. "Yes?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. The words seemed to cost him something to form. "What?"
"He said them you. He was wrong. About all of it, and I am glad you ran, because if you had not, I would not have met you." Claire's breath caught. She did not know what to say. She did not know how to hold the weight of his words without breaking. "Good night, Edward," she managed. "Good night, Claire." She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her hand pressed to her chest, where her heart was beating fast and warm. Outside her window, the moon hung low over the castle walls, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was running. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The morning of the market dawned cold and bright, the kind of sharp autumn day that made the world feel newly made. Claire rose early, braided her hair with care, and chose her best dress, a soft blue wool that Martha had insisted she keep. She was standing at the window, watching the servants load carts in the courtyard, when she heard the commotion. Horses, many of them, coming fast. She turned from the window and walked to the door of her room, her heart picking up its pace. From the corridor she could hear raised voices, the clatter of hooves on stone, and then, cutting through it all, a voice she had spent 2 years learning to flinch at. "Laurel Aldrich of Harrowmire, here to speak with the Lord of Thornwood." Claire's blood went cold. Her hand flew to the door frame to steady herself. He had found her. She should have known he would. She had told herself in the weeks since she ran that the forest was deep, the roads were long, and she was just one woman among many. But Aldrich had always been able to find her. He had always known where she was, what she was doing, who she was speaking to. It was one of the things that had made her feel so small. The world
"Thought on me." He seemed to see everything, control everything. She pressed her back against the wall beside the window, her breath short and shallow. Below, in the courtyard, she could see the riders dismounting. Aldrich was at the front, tall, fair-haired, immaculate in his dark riding cloak. He looked exactly as he always had, composed, certain, utterly convinced that the world would bend to his will. And then Edward walked out to meet him. Claire pressed her palm to her mouth, watching. Edward moved down the steps of the great hall with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. He did not hurry, he did not raise his voice. He simply walked out into the morning light and stood before Aldrich as if he had been expecting him all along.
"Lord Aldrich," Edward said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "You are far from Harrowmire." Aldrich inclined his head, a gesture that was more challenge than courtesy. "I have come for what is mine."
"And you've come to the wrong place. Nothing in Thornwood belongs to you." Aldrich's jaw tightened. "I speak of my betrothed, a woman by the name of Claire, of Ashford Village. She left my household without my leave, and I have reason to believe she is sheltered here." Edward was silent for a long moment. Claire could see his profile from where she stood, the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of stone. "Claire is a guest in my hall. She came to me of her own will, and she has remained of her own will. I do not keep unwilling people in Thornwood. Lord Aldrich, I am not that kind of lord. She is my betrothed. By contract and by law, she belongs in my household." "By contract and by law," Edward repeated, and chuckled. Here was something almost gentle in his tone. "Tell me, Lord Aldrich, does she want to go with you?" Aldrich's face reddened. "What a woman wants is a matter for the hearth, not for politics. She made a promise. Her mother made a promise. She will honor it." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her mother. The words cut through her like a blade. She felt the familiar ache of guilt rise in her chest, the thought she had carried every day since she ran, that she had failed her mother, that she had broken a promise made on her behalf, that she had shamed the woman who had loved her. She turned away from the window. She could not watch any more. She could not stand there, listening to Aldrich speak of her as if she were a piece of property, a debt to be collected. She made her way down the narrow servants' stair, her feet finding the steps by memory. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay still. The walls of the castle felt too close, the air too thin. She emerged into a small courtyard behind the kitchens, empty of people. She leaned against the stone wall and pressed her hands to her face, trying to breathe. Her lungs felt tight, her chest heavy with the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. "Child," Claire looked up, startled. Martha was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, a flour-dusted apron tied over her gray wool dress. Her face was kind, and her eyes were knowing. "I saw the riders," Martha said simply. "I figured you might be needing a moment." Claire tried to smile, but it came out as a tremble. "I'm all right." "No, you're not." Martha walked over and stood beside her, not touching, just present. "And that's all right, too. There is no shame in not being all right, child." Claire's eyes stunned. She had been holding herself so carefully, so tightly, for so long. And here, in this quiet courtyard, with the smell of bread and wood smoke around her, something in her began to loosen. "I was to marry him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother arranged it before she died. She thought he would be good to me. She thought he would take care of me." Martha said nothing, only nodded, a gentle invitation to continue. "He was good at first, kind even, but then—" Claire stopped, swallowed.
Then it changed. He began to tell me things. That I was foolish, that I was ungrateful, that I should be thankful he had chosen me because no one else would. He said I was too quiet, too plain, too simple. He said I was lucky to have him, and if I ever left, I would be nothing. Her voice cracked on the word nothing. She pressed her hand to her chest, as if she could hold the pieces of herself together. He said it so often and so quietly that I began to believe it. I began to think he was right, that I was nothing without him, that I should be grateful for his attention even when it hurt. Martha reached out and took Claire's hand, the one with the small scar on her little finger. She held it gently, firmly. "Child," she said, "let me tell you something. I have lived in this castle for 40 years. I have seen lords and ladies, kings and queens, fools and wise men, and I have learned one thing above all others." She looked at Claire with steady, kind eyes. "There is no tiredness like the tiredness of pretending to be fine when you are not, and there is no freedom like the freedom of telling the truth about what you have carried." Claire's tears spilled over at last. She did not try to stop them. She stood in the little courtyard, with the old housekeeper holding her hand, and wept for Eve. Think you had been holding in for years. When she was done, Martha handed her a handkerchief from her apron pocket, clean and neatly folded. "Now," Martha said briskly, "you wash your face and you come inside. I have bread to pull from the oven, and you are going to help me slice it. There is no problem in this world that cannot be faced with a full belly and a steady hand." Claire laughed, a small wet laugh. "Is that another thing you learned in 40 years? "It is," Martha said, "and it is true." Later that evening, after the bread was baked and the servants had gone to their beds, Claire found herself standing outside Edward's study. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of candlelight fell across the corridor floor. She hesitated. She had not spoken to him since the morning's confrontation. She did not know what to say. "Thank you" felt too small. "I'm sorry" felt too heavy. But she could not walk away, not without saying something. She pushed the door open slowly. Edward was sitting at his desk, his head bowed over a piece of parchment. In one hand he held a letter, old, yellowed, creased from folding and unfolding. He did not look up at once. When he did, his gray-blue eyes were tired, and there was something raw in them that she had never seen before. "Claire," he said, "you should be resting." "I could not sleep." She took a step into the room. "I wanted to thank you. For today, for what you said." He set the letter down carefully, his fingers lingering on the edge. "It was the truth, nothing more." "Most people do not tell the truth when it costs them something," Claire said quietly. Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I have spent 5 years not telling the truth. I have spent 5 years pretending that I was fine, that I did not feel the load, that I could carry everything alone. It is exhausting." He picked up the letter again, turning it over in his hands. Claire saw that the seal on it was broken, the wax old and cracked. "This is a letter I wrote to my wife," he said, 5 years ago. "I never sent it." Claire's breath caught. She waited. He did not open it. He simply held it, as if it were something precious and terrible at once. "I wrote it the night she died," he said, his voice low. "I wrote everything I had not said to her, everything I had been too afraid to say. I wrote it, and I sealed it, and I never sent it. I told myself it was because there was no point. She was gone. The words would not reach her." He looked up at Claire, and there was something broken in his expression, something he had kept hidden for a very long time. "I was wrong," he said. "The words matter, even if they are not heard, even if they are only spoken into the dark. The words matter." Claire walked to the desk and stood beside him. She did not touch him. She simply stood there, a quiet presence in the candlelight. "Would you like to tell me about her?" she asked gently. Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Her name was Eleanor. She had red hair, and she laughed, too loudly, and she was the bravest person I have ever known." He paused. "She died giving birth to our son. The child did not survive either." Claire's heart ached. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would fit the shape of such a loss. "I have not spoken her name in 5 years," Edward said. "I thought that if I did not speak it, the grief would fade, but it has only grown heavier. He set the letter down and looked at Claire. "Thank you," he said, "for listening, for being here, for not asking me to be anything other than what I am."
Claire reached out and placed her hand over his, just for a moment. Her touch was light, warm, a promise without words. "I am here," she said, "and I am not going anywhere." Outside the window, the moon rose over Thornwood, and somewhere in the dark, the riders of Harrowmere made camp beyond the border. But in the quiet of the study, two broken people sat together in the candlelight, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. The first night, Claire thought nothing of it. She had woken in the small hours, thirsty, and had gone to the corridor to fetch water from the basin. The window at the end of the hall faced north toward the border, and there she saw him, a tall figure standing motionless against the cold glass, his silhouette sharp against the pale moonlight. Edward did not turn when her footsteps echoed on the stone. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders squared, staring out at the dark line of trees that marked the edge of his lands. Beyond those trees, Aldrich's men had made camp. Claire had paused, uncertain whether to approach. In the end, she had said nothing and returned to her room. It was not her place to interrupt a man's vigil. The second night, she was already awake when the sound came. The soft creak of a door, the measured tread of boots on the stair. She lay still in the dark and listened as the footsteps passed her door and continued up toward the tower. She did not follow, but in the morning she noticed that the tea she had left in the common room the evening before was gone, and in its place sat an empty cup, rinsed and set neatly on the tray. The third night, Claire did not pretend to sleep. She rose when she heard the familiar creak of the study door, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and made Hale think it quietly to the kitchen. She built up the fire, set the kettle to warm, and waited. When the tea was ready, she carried it up the narrow stairs to the tower walk. Edward stood where she expected him to be, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon beyond the border. The wind had picked up, and the cold seeped through the stone walls like a living thing. "You will catch your death standing here night after night," she said softly. He turned, and for a moment his face held an expression she could not read. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it, as if he had not expected anyone to notice his vigil, as if he had not expected anyone to care. "I am used to the cold," he said. "Being used to a thing does not make it good for you." She held out the cup. He looked at it, then at her, and after a pause he took it. His fingers brushed hers, rough and calloused, and lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. "You should not have come up here," he said. "The wind is sharp tonight." "And yet, here I am," Claire replied. "Drink your tea before it cools." He did not argue. He raised the cup to his lips and drank, and Claire stood a little apart from him, her shawl pulled tight, looking out at the same dark line of trees. She did not ask what he was watching for. She did not ask if he had slept. She simply stood with him, a quiet presence in the cold. And that was enough. They stayed like that for a long while, the wind whistling through the crenellations, the moon riding high behind a thin veil of cloud. Below them, the castle slept. Beyond the border, the fires of Harrowmere's camp glowed like small, angry eyes in the dark. "He will not wait forever," Edward said at last, not looking at her. "Nor will the winter," Claire said. "The first snow will come within.
In a fortnight, his men will not want to fight in the snow." Edward turned his head, studying her with those gray-blue eyes. "You think like a soldier." "I think like someone who has spent her life watching people," Claire said. "Soldiers are not so different from the rest of us. They want to go home. They want to be warm. They want to be alive to see the spring." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A frightened girl," he said honestly. "Someone who ran because she had no other choice, and who would keep running until she found a safe place to hide." "And now?" He looked at her, and something in his gaze softened, just a little, just enough. "Now I am not certain you were ever running at all. Perhaps you were walking towards something, and he simply happened to be in your way." Claire felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. She looked down at her hands, gripping the edge of her shawl. "That is a kind thing to say," she said quietly. "I do not say kind things," Edward said. "I say true things. There is a difference." It was not a declaration.
It was not a promise, but Claire found that her heart was beating faster than it had any right to, and she was glad for the darkness that hid the color rising in her cheeks. They walked back down together, Edward's lantern casting a pool of warm light before them. At her door he paused. "Claire," he said. She turned. "If you hear me walking at night," he said, "you do not have to bring me tea every time. You should sleep." "I will bring you tea if I wish to bring you tea," Claire said, and she was surprised at her own boldness. "You cannot command me to rest, my lord. I am not one of your soldiers." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Lick," she almost missed it. "No," he said. "You are not." He inclined his head and continued down the corridor, and Claire watched him go, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was still beating its uneven rhythm. She did not think she would sleep, but when she lay down, the warmth of the encounter lingered, and she drifted off more quickly than she had in days. The next morning was cold and bright, the frost painting the windows in silver lace. Claire found Edward in the great hall, breaking his fast with bread and cheese, Bran standing at his side with a map spread across the table. "Lord," Bran was saying, his voice low and urgent. "The messenger came at dawn. He was waiting at the north gate when the guard opened it." Edward did not look up. "And what did the messenger say?" "He said—" Bran hesitated, glancing at Claire as she entered. "He said Lord Aldrich gives you 3 days to surrender the woman he calls his betrothed. If she is not returned by the 3rd dawn, he will consider it an act of war and march on the castle." The hall fell silent. Claire stopped in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, the warmth of the morning suddenly gone. Edward set down his cup of ale, slowly, deliberately. He still did not look at her. 3 days, he repeated. "Yes, Lord, that is not much time." "No, Lord." Edward was quiet for a long moment. Then he lifted his gaze and looked directly at Claire. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation, only a calm resolve that made her breath catch. "Then we have 3 days," he said. "Bran, double the watch on the north wall. Send riders to the outlying farms, tell them to bring their families and livestock within the walls. I want the gates closed by nightfall, and I want every able-bodied man on the ramparts by dawn." Bran nodded and hurried out. Edward rose from the table and walked toward Claire, stopping a few paces from her. "You heard," he said. "Yes." "I will not give you to him," Edward said. "Not today, not in 3 days, not ever. But you should know what that means. He will come with force. There may be blood." Claire lifted her chin. "I know." "You could leave before he arrives," Edward said, and his voice was careful, measured, as if he were offering her a choice he did not want to offer. "I could have a horse saddled, a guide to take you to the coast. You could be on a ship before he ever reaches the gate." Claire looked at him, and she remembered the empty cup he had rinsed and set back on the tray. She remembered the way he had stood in the cold, night after night, watching the border. She remembered the letter in his study, and the name he had not spoken in 5 years. "I am not leaving," she said. Edward's jaw tightened. "Claire!" "You heard me," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I am not running anymore. I told you that. I meant it." He held her gaze for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Something she could not name but felt in her chest like a hand closing around her heart. "Then we face this together," he said at last. It was not a question. It was not a promise. It was a statement of fact, as simple and certain as the frost on the window glass. Claire nodded. "Together." Edward turned and walked toward the door, then paused. Without looking back, he said, "The tea. Last night. It was good. Thank you." And then he was gone, his boots echoing on the stone, and Claire stood alone in the great hall with her heart full and her hands trembling, and she did not know whether she was afraid or not, only that, for the first time in think. With weak ears, she did not want to run. The frost had not yet lifted from the courtyard when Claire found him. Edward stood at the gate, speaking in low, clipped tones to a rider whose horse was still steaming from the road. The man's cloak was wet to the shoulders, and his face was pale beneath the grime of travel. Claire did not need to hear the words to know what the messenger carried. She had seen that look on men's faces before, the look of news that brought no comfort. She waited until the rider had been sent toward the stables, until Edward stood alone with his back to her, his hands braced against the stone of the gate as if the wall itself were the only thing holding him upright. "You said 3 days," she said quietly. He did not turn.
"The messenger says Aldrich's vanguard has already crossed the river. They will be at the border by tomorrow evening, not the day after."
Claire felt the cold seep through her boots. "So we have 2 days."
"Less."
Edward's voice was flat, stripped of its usual iron. "If they push hard, they could be here by nightfall tomorrow." She walked toward him until she stood at his shoulder, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled against the stone. She had learned to read him in the weeks since she had first grabbed his cloak in the rain, learned that his stillness was not calm, that his silence was not indifference. He was afraid, and he was trying, in his way, to protect her from that fear. "Edward." She said his name softly, the way she had learned to say it, without hesitation now. "Look at me." He turned. His gray-blue eyes were shadowed, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She had seen him command men, had seen him stand unflinching before Aldrich's threats, had seen him move through the chaos of preparation with a certainty that made other men believe. But here, in the gray light of early morning, he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "I am not going to let you face this alone," she said. "I have faced worse alone." "I know." She reached out, and after a moment's hesitation, she took his hand. His fingers were cold, rough with calluses. "But you do not have to, not this time." Edward looked down at their hands, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, very slowly, his fingers closed around hers. "You should leave," he said. But his voice had lost its certainty. "I told you. There is a ship at the northern harbor. I could have you there by nightfall." "And I told you." Claire met his eyes. "I am not running." "You do not understand what he will do." Edward's grip tightened. "Aldrich will not simply demand you back and ride away. He has been humiliated. Men like that do not forgive humiliation. He will burn fields. He will hurt people. People who have nothing to do with this. People who have sheltered you, fed you, called you kin when you had none." His voice cracked on the last word. "I cannot let that happen because of you." "Because of me." Claire's throat tightened. "Edward, he came here because of me. He will do those things whether I am here or not, because I was supposed to be his, and I chose otherwise. That is not something you caused. That is not something you can fix by sending me away. I can try. And I can stay." She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him despite the cold. "You asked me once what I was running from. I told you," he said. "I was nothing without him. But I did not tell you everything." Edward's eyes searched her face. "You do not have to." "I want to." Claire took a breath. "My mother died 2 winters ago, before she passed. She made me promise I would marry Aldrich. She thought he would take care of me, that a good marriage was the only safety a woman like me could hope for. And for a year, I tried. I tried to be grateful. I tried to be what he wanted." Her voice faltered. "But he did not want a wife. He wanted a thing, a possession, something to show off at feasts and keep locked away when no one was looking. And every time I tried to speak my mind, he would smile and say, 'You're tired, my dear. You're not thinking clearly.' He said it so often, for so long, that I began to believe it." Edward's jaw tightened. "You were never tired." "No, I was not." Claire smiled, a small, sad thing. "I was terrified, but I am not terrified anymore. I am angry, and I am done being a thing." She released his hand and reached into the small pouch she always carried. Her fingers closed around the cold circle of silver, and she drew it out. Her mother's ring, worn thin by years of use, its surface smooth and warm despite the frost. She held it up so Edward could see. "This was my mother's," she said. "She wore it every day of her life.
It was her mother's before that, and her grandmother's before that. The women in my family have passed this ring down for 4 generations, and every one of them wore it as a promise, not to a man, but to themselves, to survive, to endure, to choose. She looked at the ring, then at Edward. I am done enduring. I am choosing. Edward stared at the ring for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. What are you choosing? I am choosing to stay. Claire closed her fingers around the ring. I am choosing to face him. I am choosing to tell him, in front of everyone, that I am not his. And I am choosing to do it standing.
Next to you, if you will let me. Edward was silent for a long moment. The wind moved through the courtyard, carrying the smell of wood smoke and frost, and something faintly sweet, the last of the autumn apples, rotting in the orchards. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she almost did not hear it.
I lost my wife 5 years ago.
Claire went still. She died in childbirth, Edward said, and now that he had begun, the words seemed to come faster, as if they had been dammed up for too long. The child, too. I held her hand while she bled out on the bed, and I could not do anything. I could not save her. I could not save my son. I could not do anything but sit there and watch the light leave her eyes. He swallowed hard. After that, I told myself I would never let anyone close enough to hurt me like that again. I told myself that the only way to protect people was to keep them at arm's length, to be the wall that stood between them and the dark, so they would not have to be afraid. Claire reached for his hand again, and this time he let her take it. I kept a letter, he said. I wrote it the night she died. I never sent it. I could not. He looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes, something she had never seen before. I do not know why I am telling you this. Because you trust me, Claire said softly. Edward did not answer, but he did not pull his hand away. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 people in the grey light of a cold morning, holding on to each other as if the world were falling away around them. And perhaps it was. In 2 days, Aldrich would be at the gates with an army at his back. In 2 days, everything could change. But for now, there was only this. The warmth of their hands, the steadiness of their breath, the quiet certitude.
Think that whatever came, they would face it together.
Claire was the first to speak.
We should get ready. Edward nodded. He released her hand, but his eyes lingered on her face. Claire? Yes, he hesitated. Then he said, what you said about choosing. I believe you. He paused, and I am glad you are staying. Claire felt something in her chest loosen, a knot she had not known she was carrying. I am glad too. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Edward sent riders to every corner of the territory, calling in men from the outlying farms. The blacksmith's hammer rang, without pause from dawn until dusk. Women carried baskets of bread and dried meat to the hall, where tables had been pushed against the walls to make room for the wounded that might soon fill them. Children were sent into the forest with the shepherds, instructed to hide among the trees if they heard the war horns. Claire worked alongside Martha in the kitchen, rolling bandages and brewing the willow bark tea that eased pain. The old woman watched her with sharp, knowing eyes, but said nothing until the afternoon, when they stood alone for a moment by the fire. You are not going to leave, are you? Martha asked. No, Claire said. Good, Martha nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. He needs someone who will stay. She paused, and her voice softened. So to you, child. So to you. Claire did not know how to answer that, so she simply nodded and returned to her work. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the castle was as ready as it would ever be. The gates were barred, the walls were manned. The great hall smelled of smoke and bread and fear, but beneath it all there was something else, something stubborn and quiet, a refusal to be broken. Claire found Edward on the battlements as the last light faded. He stood with his back to her, looking out toward the dark line of the forest where Aldrich's army would soon appear. She did not speak. She simply walked up beside him and stood there, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and together they watched the darkness gather. After a long moment, Edward spoke. You should sleep. So should you. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, if he remembered how. I cannot.
Then I will stay awake with you. Edward turned his head, his eyes catching the last of the light. Claire? Yes? He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since she had known him, he looked as if he did not know what to say. Finally, he reached into his coat and drew out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges, creased and folded so many times the ink had begun to fade. "This is the letter," he said. "The one I wrote the night she died." Claire looked at it, then at him. "Why are you showing me?" "Because I want you to know." His voice was rough. "I want you to know that I have not been able to say these words to anyone for 5 years. And I want you to know that if we do not survive this, we will survive this. Claire," his voice was sharp, almost pleading, "if we do not, I want you to know that I would have told you." He held the letter out to her. "Read it, or do not. It is yours either way." Claire took the letter with hands that trembled slightly. She did not open it. She held it, feeling the worn paper, the weight of 5 years of silence folded into its creases. "I will read it," she said, "when this is over. When we are both standing on the other side of whatever is coming, I will read it then." Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "Together." He said, "Together?" She agreed. They stood in silence as the last light faded and the stars emerged cold and bright above the dark line of the forest. Somewhere out there, an army was marching toward them. But here, on this wall, 2 people stood side by side, and neither one was running. The war horn sounded at dawn. Claire woke to the deep, mournful call echoing over the hills, and her heart slammed against her ribs. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, pulling on her dress, her boots, her cloak. When she reached the courtyard, it was already full of men, farmers with pitchforks, shepherds with their staffs, knights in full armor, all moving with a desperate, ordered haste. Edward stood at the center of it all, issuing commands in a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. He saw her across the courtyard, and for a moment their eyes met. Then he turned back to his men, and Claire understood. It had begun. The war horns faded into the gray morning, and for a long moment the courtyard held its breath. Then the gates groaned open, and a column of riders entered Thornwood, not with swords drawn, but with the slow, deliberate arrogance of men who believed they had already won. At their head, Lord Aldrich sat tall on a black horse, his cloak heavy with silver embroidery, his chin lifted as if he were surveying land he already owned. He did not dismount when he reached the center of the courtyard. He simply looked around, taking in the armed men, the closed doors, the drawn faces. "Where is she?" he called out, his voice carrying easily across the stones. "I have come for my betrothed." Edward stood at the top of the steps leading into the great hall, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Behind him, the heavy oak doors stood open, and beyond them, the hall as dark and still. "She is not your betrothed," Edward said quietly. "She has said so herself." Aldrich's smile was thin and patient, the smile of a man who had never been told no in his life. "With respect, Lord Thornwood, a woman in distress says many things she does not mean. I have traveled 3 days to take her home. I would ask you to bring her to me." "I will not bring her to you," Edward said. "But if she wishes to speak with you, she will come of her own accord." The words hum in the air and the courtyard grew very quiet. Then from behind Edward a figure stepped out of the shadows of the great hall. Claire walked forward slowly, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She had dressed carefully that morning, a simple grey wool dress, her hair braided tight, the small silver ring on her finger catching the pale light. She looked for the first time in her life like someone who had made a decision and intended to keep it. Aldrich's face softened when he saw her. "Claire," he said, and his voice was warm, almost gentle. "There you are. I have been so worried about you." Claire stopped at the top of the steps, a few feet from Edward. She did not look at him. She looked only at Aldrich. "You were not worried," she said quietly. "You were angry. Those are not the same thing." Aldrich's smile flickered. "Claire, please, come down from there. We can talk about this properly, in private, like civilized people." "We can talk about it here," Claire said. "In front of everyone, I have nothing to hide." The words seemed to strike Aldrich like a physical blow. He sat very still on his horse for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its warmth. "You are my betrothed," he said. "Your mother gave you to me with her own hand. That is a thing that cannot be broken by a change of heart." Claire felt the words land in her chest like stones. Her mother. She had spent so many years trying to honor that memory, trying to believe that her mother had wanted this for her, that it was her duty to obey. She had never once let herself ask the question that now rose in her throat. "My mother," she said slowly, "died when I was 17. She was ill for a long time before that, and I have spent every day since then trying to be the daughter she wanted me to be." She paused. "Tell me, Aldrich, what did she say to you when she gave you her blessing?" Aldrich's jaw tightened. "She said you were a good girl, that you would make a fine wife." "That is not what I asked," Claire said. "I asked what she said to you. In private, when no one else was listening." The courtyard was silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, standing still with their ears pricked forward. Aldrich looked at Claire, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of unease quickly suppressed. "She said she wanted you to be taken care of," he said at last. "That is all." Claire shook her head slowly. "No, that is not all. I know my mother, Aldrich. I know the way she spoke, the way she chose her words. If she had wanted me to be taken care of, she would have said that to me. She would have held my hand and told me herself." She took a step down the stairs. "So I will ask you again. What did she say to you?" For a long moment, Aldrich did not answer. Then he dismounted, slowly, deliberately, and walked toward the steps until he stood at the bottom, looking up at her. "Your mother," he said, and his voice was low, almost kind, "was a woman who understood the way the world works. She knew that a woman alone has no power, no protection, no beesher. She knew that the only way for you to be safe was to be bound to a man who could keep you safe." He paused. "She asked me to give you a good life. That is the truth." Claire felt the tears rising, and she did not try to stop them. "She asked you to give me a good life," she repeated. "And you thought that meant owning me, controlling me, telling me I was worthless without you." Aldrich's face stiffened. "I never said you were worthless." "You said it in 100 ways," Claire said. "Every time you corrected me in front of others, every time you told me I was too sensitive, too emotional, too naive, every time you made me feel that my opinions were foolish and my wishes were childish." Her voice trembled, but she did not look away. "You did not want a wife, Aldrich. You wanted a possession. And my mother wanted me to be safe. She did not know the difference." The silence that followed was so complete that Claire could hear the wind moving through the trees beyond the castle walls. She saw Aldrich's face shift through several expressions. Anger, then something that might have been shame, then anger again. "She wanted me to keep you safe," he said, and his voice was harder now. "And I have tried. But you have made that impossible. You ran from me in the night, without a word, without a thought for the scandal you would bring upon my house. You have made me a laughingstock in front of every lord in the kingdom." "Then let me be a scandal," Claire said quietly. "Let them laugh. I would rather be a scandal than a ghost." She reached down and slipped the small silver ring from her finger. It had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that, passed down through generations of women who had worn it through joy and grief and everything in between. She had worn it every day since her mother died, as a promise that she would carry the memory forward. Now she held it out, and her hand was steady. "This ring was my mother's," she said. "It was never meant to be a bride price. It was never meant to be a seal on a bargain. It was a promise that the women in my family would always carry each other forward, and I have carried it long enough." She opened her hand, and the ring fell into Aldrich's palm. He caught it by reflex, staring down at it as if he did not understand what had just happened. "Take it," Claire said. "Take it and take your promise with it. I am not your betrothed. I am not your possession. I am my own." For a long moment no one moved. Then, from the edge of the courtyard, a low voice spoke. "Perhaps," Edward said, "Lord Aldrich would like to hear what I have to say." He stepped forward, and Claire turned to look at him. In his hand was a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon. She recognized it immediately. The letter he had given her the night before, the one she had chosen not to read. She had given it back to him that morning, without a word. She had not been ready. But now, as he held it up before the assembled crowd, she understood that he was ready for her. "I wrote this letter 5 years ago," Edward said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I wrote it to my wife who had died 3 days before. I wrote it because I could not say the words to her face, and I could not bear to let them go unsaid." He untied the ribbon and the parchment unfolded in his hands. The courtyard was utterly silent. Even Aldrich stood still, the ring forgotten in his palm. "I wrote, I do not know how to love anyone again. I do not know how to let anyone close enough to hurt me the way your little even has hurt me, but I know that I cannot live forever with my heart sealed shut. I know that somewhere, someday, I will have to learn to try again." He looked up and his eyes met Claire's. "I do not know if I will recognize her when I find her," he continued, his voice softer now. "But I hope that she will be patient with me. I hope that she will see past the armor I have built, and I hope that I will be brave enough to let her in." He folded the letter carefully, and his hands were not quite steady. "I wrote that letter 5 years ago," he said, "and I never sent it. I thought it was a confession of weakness. I thought it was proof that I was not strong enough to be the lord this land needed." He paused, "But I was wrong. It was not weakness. It was the truth, and I have been hiding from the truth for 5 years." He looked at Claire and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Claire, I do not know if I will recognize the woman I have been waiting for, but I know that when you grabbed my cloak in the rain, I felt something I had not felt in 5 years. I felt like I was not alone." Claire felt the tears streaming down her face, and she did not wipe them away. She walked down the steps, past Aldrich, past the horses, until she stood in front of Edward. "I read your letter this morning," she said, and her voice was thick. "After I gave it back to you, I realized I was afraid, not of what it said, but of what it meant." She reached out and took his hand, and then I realized I have been afraid for so long, afraid of disappointing my mother, afraid of failing Aldrich, afraid of being alone. But I am not afraid anymore. She squeezed his hand, and she smiled through her tears. "You said you hope she will be patient with you. I am patient. You said you hope she will think past the armor. I see you, Edward. I see you." Behind them, Aldrich let out a sound that was half laugh, half snarl. "This is a performance," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "This is a scheme to humiliate me in front of my men. You think I will simply walk away and leave her here with you?" Edward turned to face him and his voice was calm. "I think," he said, "that you will walk away because you have no other choice. She has told you she is not yours. I have told you she is not mine. She is her own. There is no law in this kingdom that forces a woman to marry a man she does not want, and there is no army that can make her love you." Aldrich stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Claire, and something in his face crumbled, not into anger, but into something older, sadder. "I did love you," he said quietly, "in my way." Claire met his eyes. "I know," she said, "but your way was not mine." Aldrich looked down at the ring in his palm. Then, slowly, he closed his fingers around it and turned away. He did not look back. He mounted his horse, signaled to his men, and rode out of the courtyard without another word. The gates closed behind him with a heavy thud, and the sound echoed through the castle like a door closing on an old life. The courtyard was silent for a long moment. Then someone began to cheer, and the sound spread like wildfire, filling the air with shouts and laughter and relief. Claire stood still in the middle of it all, her hands still clasped in Edward's, and she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt free. When the crowd finally dispersed and the courtyard began to settle back into its daily rhythm, Edward turned to her. His face was streaked with dust and exhaustion, but his eyes were soft. "You said you read my letter," he said. "I told myself I would not read it, that it was yours, and I had no right." She smiled. "But I read it anyway." "And?" Edward asked, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that made her heart ache. Claire reached up and touched his face, her fingers brushing the old scar above his brow. "You wrote that you hoped she would be brave enough to let you in," she said. "She is. I am." Edward closed his eyes, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting her hand rest against his cheek. Then he opened his eyes, and he took her other hand in his. "The sun is rising," he said softly. "Would you walk with me? Just to the edge of the courtyard where we can see it?" Claire laughed, a small, watery sound. "After everything that has happened this morning, you want to watch the sunrise?" "I want to watch the sunrise with you," Edward said. "I have waited 5 years to feel like I am not alone. I do not want to wait another moment." Claire did not answer with words. She simply took his arm, and together they walked across the courtyard, past the empty gates, past the remnants of the crowd, to the low stone wall that overlooked the valley. The sun was rising over the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The war was over before it had truly begun. The threat was gone. And in the quiet of the morning, 2 people stood side by side, their hands intertwined, watching the light spread across the land. Claire leaned her head against Edward's shoulder. "I ran away from my wedding," she said, "and I ended up here. I do not understand how that happened." Edward smiled. "Perhaps you were not running away from something," he said. "Perhaps you were running towards some thing." Claire considered this. "What was I running toward?" Edward did not answer at first. He simply stood there, watching the sun climb higher, his hand warm around hers. "Toward the place where you could stop running," he said at last. "And I hope, you have found it." Claire closed her eyes and let the warmth of the sun wash over her. She did not know what the future held. She did not know if she would ever fully understand the strange path that had led her here, to this wall, to this man, to this moment. But she knew one thing: she was not running anymore. And that, she thought, was enough. The kitchen at Thornwood Castle smelled of bread and wood smoke and something sweet that Claire could not quite name. She stood at the long oak table, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands dusted with flour, trying to shape a loaf that refused to behave. "You are fighting it," Martha said from the hearth, where she was stirring a pot of stew with the air of a general commanding a battle. "Bread is like people, child. You cannot force it. You have to persuade it." "I am persuading," Claire muttered, pressing her thumb into the dough, very persuasively. Martha snorted. "That is not persuasion. That is aggression." Claire laughed, and the sound surprised her. 3 months ago she had not known how to laugh like this, without holding back, without wondering if someone would use it against her. Now she laughed freely, and the kitchen felt warmer for it. The door creaked open, and a gust of cold air swept in. Claire did not need to look up to know who it was. She had learned the rhythm of his footsteps weeks ago. Heavy, deliberate, always pausing just inside the door, as if he was not sure he was allowed to be there. "Lord," Martha said without turning around, "you are let think the cold in." Edward closed the door behind him with a quiet click. "I came to see if the bread was ready." "It is not," Claire said, still shaping the loaf. "It is being persuaded." Edward walked over to the table and stood beside her, looking down at the dough with the same expression he wore when inspecting a map of enemy territory. "It looks like it is losing the argument." Claire laughed again, and this time she looked up at him. His hair was dusted with snow, and his cheeks were red from the ride-in. He had been out since before dawn, checking the eastern border, and he had not bothered to change before coming to the kitchen. She liked that about him, that he came to her like this, still carrying the cold and the wind and whatever burdens the day had brought. "Your face is frozen," she said. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You are blue." Martha made a sound that was half laugh and half disapproval. "Sit down, Lord, before you drip on my floor. Claire, pour him some tea. There is honey in the jar." Claire wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the hearth where a kettle hung over the fire. She poured the tea carefully, adding a generous spoonful of honey, and carried it to Edward, who had settled onto a stool near the fire with the stiffness of a man who did not sit often. He took the cup, and his fingers brushed hers. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Martha watched them from the corner of her eye and said nothing, but her mouth curved into a small, knowing smile. The bread came out of the oven at midday, golden and fragrant. Claire cut a thick slice and handed it to Edward before she took one for herself. He ate it in silence, but there was something in his expression, a softening around the eyes, that she had come to recognize as his way of thinking. They sat together on the bench by the fire, the snow falling softly outside the window, and Claire thought about how strange it was to be here.
3 months ago, she had been running through a rain-soaked forest, terrified and alone, with nothing but a mother's silver ring in a small cloth pouch. Now she sat in the warm kitchen of a castle, eating bread she had made with her own hands, beside a man who had once been a stranger and was now the person she trusted most in the world. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. Edward looked at her. "Think about what?" "The night we met, the rain, the cloak." A faint smile crossed his face, rare and fleeting like sunlight through clouds. "I think about it often." "What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think about how close I came to sending you away the next morning, before I knew who you were, before I knew anything about you." He paused. "I would have been a fool." Claire felt warmth spread through her chest. "You were very kind to me that night. You did not have to be. I did not know how to be anything else." She looked down at her hands, still dusted with flour. "I did not know how to be anything but afraid. That night I thought my life was over. I thought I had nowhere to go." She looked up at him. "I did not know I was running toward you." Edward said nothing, but he reached out and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, rough with calluses. It felt like a promise. In the afternoon, Claire went to her room to change. The room was modest, a bed, a chest, a small window that looked out over the Bailey, but it was hers. No one could enter without her permission. No one could tell her what to do in it. She had never had a room that was truly hers before. She opened the small wooden box on the chest. Inside, nestled in a cloth, was the silver ring. She had taken it back from Uldric that day in the great hall, after he had dropped it into her palm and ridden away. She had not known then what she would do with it. She had only known that she could not leave it with him. She picked up the ring now and turned it over in her fingers. It was simple. A thin band of silver, worn smooth by generations of women in her family. Her mother had worn it, her grandmother before her. It was not a promise to any man. It was a promise to herself. Claire slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as it always had. She looked at her hand for a long moment, then closed her fingers into a fist and held it against her heart. The sun was low in the sky when Edward found her in the stable, saddling a horse. He raised an eyebrow. "You are going somewhere?" "I was hoping you would come with me," she said. "There is something I want to see." He did not ask what. He simply nodded and saddled his own horse, and together they rode out of the castle gates and into the winter landscape. The snow had stopped, and the world was quiet and white. The horses moved slowly, their breath misting in the cold air. Claire led the way, and Edward followed, asking no questions. They rode to the edge of the territory, where the land fell away into a long, sweeping valley. From here, one could see the whole of Thornwood, the fields, the forest, the distant roofs of the village, the smoke rising from chimneys into the pale winter sky. Edward had told her once that he came here to think, to be alone, to remember what he was protecting. They dismounted and stood side by side at the edge of the cliff. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The snow caught the air light and turned pink, and the world was so beautiful that it hurt. Claire took a deep breath. "I used to think that home was a place you ran from, a place that held you back." She looked out at the valley. "I was wrong." Edward turned to look at her. "What do you think now?" She looked down at her hand, at the silver ring catching the last of the light. "I think home is not the place you flee. Home is the place you want to stay." Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand in his fingers lacing through hers. His grip was warm and steady. "I never thought I would want to stay anywhere again," he said quietly. "After I lost her, I thought the rest of my life would be just standing guard, watching over this land because it was my duty, not because I wanted to be here." He paused. "Then you came, and I found myself wanting to stay, not because I had to, because you were here." Cleda felt tears prick at her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She squeezed his hand instead. "Edward," she said softly. He looked at her. "Thank you for not sending me away that morning." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, just above the silver ring. "Thank you for running toward me." The sun sank lower, and the sky deepened into violet and blue. The wind picked up, cold and sharp. But neither of them moved. They stood together at the edge of the cliff, hand in hand, watching the light fade over the land they had each, in their own way, chosen. After a long while, Claire spoke. "What happens now?" Edward was quiet for a moment. "Now," he said, "we go home. To the kitchen, to the fire, to whatever tomorrow brings." "That sounds good," she said. "It is," he said. "It finally is." They mounted their horses and rode back toward the castle.
The lights of Thornwood glowing warm in the distance, Claire looked at the ring on her finger, and she smiled. She was not running anymore. She was home. Claire thought she was desperately escaping her cage, unaware that she was actually heading towards her true destiny, and the seemingly cold-blooded Wolf King finally found the soul who dared to see through his hard armor and warm his frozen heart. True love is never about control and deprivation, but about two wounded hearts redeeming and protecting each other in the cold winter. If it were you, on that dangerous rainy night, would you have the courage to entrust your fate to a stranger? Leave your choice in the comments. If you liked this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.